Green.
Wait. Oh, no, not at all.
So hello, everyone. Welcome to today's event, Creativity in the Age of AI. My name is Paul, and I will be gently moderating this discussion. So as generative AI tools become ubiquitous and available to us in everyday interactions, many interesting new questions emerge. So first, do these generative AI tools actually make us more creative? Do they help us generate new, original, authentic content? Then policymakers, regulators are trying to figure out what kind of legal, economic, social interventions should be made to accelerate innovation and accelerate it in the way that benefits more stakeholders in the market. And finally, many deeply rooted concepts have to be reimagined in this new human-machine interaction. What is human authorship? What is control? What is authenticity, originality? These questions deserve more attention. And for the conversation today, we have an amazing lineup of speakers for you. So first of all, let me introduce them briefly. Of course, I'm very happy to have Davey here. Davey is an AI artist who has been working with AI tools for quite a while. And the idea of this event was born when we saw Davey's exhibition a few weeks ago in one of the galleries here in San Francisco. His images were so amazing, we thought that Davey's story has to be told. So Davey, thanks for being here. Then we have Professor Jacques de Vera, who is an IP expert from Switzerland, currently visiting Stanford, teaching an advanced course on contracts. Ashley Greenwald is an international award-winning interior designer working with tech companies here, helping them to build offices. Max is working at Midjourney as a general counsel and is at the forefront of this innovative breakthrough. And finally, we have our host, Kat, who is also a leading IP expert here. Thank you, Kat, for hosting us. So without further ado, how about we give a round of applause?
Very easy to volunteer space that is not in your own home.
So how about we start with Davey? And I would like to ask Davey to tell about your creative process and actually what project have you been working on and how do these AI tools help you come up with creative content? How do you discover originality in your work? So we're excited to hear.
Thanks, Paul. So thanks for inviting me, and thanks to Reed Smith and to my fellow panelists. It's not exactly a normal thing that I'd be invited to a law firm unless I did something wrong. So it's kind of cool. Hope that hasn't happened. Pre and post me working with AI, my work has always been about revealing the intricacies of human and nuances of human perception. And I do that through abstractions of landscapes into colorscapes and color fields. So my work is motivated by trying to provoke a process that an artist called James Turrell coined. He calls it, seeing yourself see, just kind of like observing yourself observing. It's kind of a more inward, let's say, interaction that you would have with the art piece, as opposed to something where, you know, if my work had was traditional landscape and it had things that you'd recognize more details. Obviously, there's no details in my work. You'd have a very different like interaction. You'd be the side of your brain that deals with semiotics would be busy identifying everything, and then it would be busy, you know, referencing all the other ones of that thing, that all the other sailboats that you'd seen and all the other islands and whatever. So my work starts from starts basically video and photography, but it ends up as these kind of colorscapes that that are just about the kind of colors that color fields that nature and urban landscapes can come up with. And so this is a kind of this is a work that I did before I started working with AI. And the second part of the question is, well, now it's a little bit of a story. It should only take a few minutes about how I've started working with AI. And what I'll do is we'll go to the first video, Metaphysical Supplements, so that we can, it's a video, it's the only project that I've actually done that actively employed AI in the production of the piece. And I'll tell you why that's important later. You can go ahead and start it. So that piece, like I said, it was I think it's kind of the only piece that's been shown publicly that I've employed AI in the production of it. And so what I did, I began the process of making that video started with me working with a tool that NVIDIA made that I thought was like the most interesting AI creativity tool out there when I was making this, because it was really clunky and it was very easy to misuse it, and it was very unpredictable, which are things that, like, as an artist, are super important to me. I don't want to go into a process and already know what's going to come out the other end, because it's not for me, that's not it's not creative. There's no process there, and that's the kind of the trouble I had with a lot of the tools that were still, in fact, trouble that I have with a lot of the AI tools is that it's kind of a predictable outcome. It's more, I don't feel that there's a ton of process involved in getting to a result, at least in my case. And so this tool was pretty interesting because it kind of gave you a digital paintbrush, and it allowed you to kind of paint digitally with like the aesthetic qualities of landscape. So clearly it had been trained on forest, clouds. What does an ocean look like? What do mountains look like? What does a field look like? Grass, etc. And you kind of click through these different functions and paint, like, kind of cordon off areas on the screen, and it would sort of try and cram in a mountain or cram in an ocean into these kind of places, which is super awkward, but really kind of amazing and beautiful in a way. So I made several of these. I made quite a few of these, like, landscape paintings, let's say, using that tool. And then I fed it to an AI that is best described as me cutting and pasting a whole lot of different code from the foundational code from a lot of stuff that's being used now, which is all open source. So, and I'm not a programmer, but I was able to sort of piece things together and figure out how to make things run good enough to do what I wanted to do. It took a while, but so I fed it into an AI that I'm going to speak in general terms. No, it's not technical terms, but I kind of fed it into an AI, and I asked the AI to think about what it sees and to create, to expand on it, to create more, to create variations, and to create a video out of it that was 4K and 3 minutes or something. I forget. I gave it a few extra nuances and nudges, but basically it had those landscape things that I fed it to go on. And the results were like astounding to me, because not because of what it did, but because of what it didn't do. It didn't use gravity or a horizon. So, the Earth, we have this horizontal horizon that's created by geoplanetary that's created by the Earth. And we have gravity that's like, that kind of informs all entire human visuality, I think. So I hadn't thought of that before. This, like, I was so impressed at how this AI creator didn't use those principles. And as a landscape artist, as a human earth-based landscape artist, I could never, it's so difficult to break free from those things. You're literally bound to the earth by gravity, and you're literally surrounded by the horizon 24 hours a day. So I really thought this is like super interesting. I gotta I'm going to work with those. I'm going to work without those concepts. I'm going to start making work that does not involve gravity and tries to not use horizons. And the first thing I did is the next video called "The All Together Now," which I think was in the exhibition that you saw. This is me working with the ocean in a way that was inspired by how I thought the AI worked with the landscapes that I fed it. So after this video, I thought, well, I should go back to these still images that I'm making and see if I can apply the same artistic process. So these are, again, the same beginnings of the work that you saw before. The work that you saw in the beginning is actually a sunset over the Danube River in Serbia. It came out of the camera pretty similar to what you saw. And then I started working with, okay, what happens if we don't have a horizon line? I figured out a process to kind of remap horizons into spheres or remap horizons into 360 degrees. So these stills, if I could kind of unravel them or kind of like apply gravity and a horizon line to them, and you might start recognizing, okay, that's a cloud bank. Okay, I see fog here. I see. Some of these are actually taken in urban landscape where you have signs creating these neons and everything. But if I unraveled them, you'd start to recognize things. So I can't go back. Okay. So just to sum up, so my artistic collaborations with synthetic intelligence have helped me interrogate what my idea of the natural. And the parameters that I've used in the works they're collaboratively created with AI, and the work proposes a kind of a world with alternate geometries and impossible physics, and kind of the way that I use AI is more of an ideation partner. I really don't use it so much in terms of production, which is, I think, really the prevailing method that at least the software described to us. Anyway, thank you.
That's great. We probably have many ideas and follow-up questions, but I would like to ask Max to explain a little bit from his personal experience. How is Midjourney bringing those tools to everyday person? Really talk about making tools available for anyone, and then really helping us to explore these new opportunities. Probably it's not a legal question.
I'll just tell a personal story. Maybe I'll just tell a personal story. So when we were just it was very early and the early versions of the algorithms didn't look great. And I just was trying to joke around with the product. So I started, and I also, this was at the height of the NFT craze. So I was like, this is it. I'm banking on this. It's like a week or two before people have heard of AI generated NFTs. Let's corner the market. So I made my first series, which was Celebs is Pizza. And I showed my in-laws and I thought this was like the weirdest thing ever. So I had like Tom Cruise as a pepperoni pizza, just various celebrities and different types of pizza. I got a good laugh out of it. I thought it was hilarious. So I thought, oh, this is obviously some kind of joke tool for me to make things that make me laugh. So then I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a next series. I never was able to sell any of these, but I impressed my in-laws a lot. The second series was called Affordable Housing, and it was supposed to be about a bunch of houses. And at first I was just joking around again. And so I'd create a really weird or surreal type of house and then put a description on it. And then something very strange happened that made me feel, it was an amazing experience. First picture, created some kind of house, put a joking description on it. Then as I kept going, I saw that I started describing houses that I'd actually lived in. And then the descriptions that I gave to them became less and less jokey and more sincere. And I was just very shocked by that experience because it was supposed to be a joke machine, not a machine for me to, interrogate my past or, do anything sincere. I just wanted to make more pizza-faced celebrities. But what it really showed me was like exactly what Midjourney's point is, and I think what most of these tools' point is, the AI is just kind of an incidental tool. These are narrative machines. And we all have so many stories to tell. And I'm a lawyer, very verbal. I was never able to draw, and I always felt like a pain in not being able to express myself graphically. But all of a sudden, I was able to like talk about things in an imagistic way that I just didn't have the words or vocabulary for. And I think like, if you look at we could talk about legal stuff, but you asked me a non-legal question, but if you look at our policies or what we're trying to do with the platform or take an IP, the point, at least for us, is not to create stuff like I was trying to do. It's not so you can corner the market on NFTs. It's so people can have really enriched conversations with each other. And so we want to advance the ability for people to talk to each other. Personally, I get a little sad when I see the focus on, oh, the point of this is to is to reproduce automatically someone else's work, which is like, there's already tools to do that. But I think, I hope that more of society starts getting the great experience I got. It says that, all right, I've regenerated every image I thought I could generate. I've generated everything I've ever seen in the style of everything else I've ever seen. I've made every single t-shirt I can make and sold it to anyone who will buy it. But then the real work comes in is like, well, what has no one seen before? And now I can express myself. And so I guess like we want to make a good home for that, so that we want to make that accessible to as many people as possible.
Great. I think we are all happy to experiment and explore new universes. I have a question for Ashley. So when we think about the adoption of those tools in highly creative environments, such as yours, interior design, what are the opportunities and what are the challenges that you see?
Good question. So, some of the opportunities that we see is, at least, interior design is kind of one part, which is storytelling, creativity, and then one part, which is sort of technical problem solving. And, when you combine those together, there's kind of the group that the baseline of AI, which you're like, gosh, I wish there was a tool out there that would just make all my construction documents happen and I didn't have to draw them all myself. Of course there are, cut and paste from different projects, different things like that. But, you wish there was something that was slightly more intuitive where you model something and it automatically can say like, oh, you need this detail and that detail. And because you modeled it like this, it should look like that. Instead, we still have to draw all that out. That's sort of one aspect. Another aspect is basic code review. So we've got again, on the technical side, like, automating code reviews would be amazing, where you don't have to go to the city and negotiate with a city city inspector. And they're like, oh no, we disagree. That's the wrong size of something or other. And you're like, why should we even be negotiating this? Like, it's in a code somewhere. We should not be negotiating this. So there's, those aspects that, automating some of those basic tasks to then give us the freedom and license to do more of the creative aspects, which, start very iterative. And so having AI tools that also can iterate on, whether it's floor plans or whether it's programs or whether it's analyzing certain aspects of kind of psychological aspects of design, right? And creating spaces that, and iterating with the tool that can assist in that creative way that we don't normally have. So I think that's also quite exciting, is like, there are some really basic aspects that would be amazing, but there's also, iterating and creating unique works together with technology in concert. We do that human to human, but what if we could speed it up, make it smarter, and, make the whole process less expensive for clients? Like, who wouldn't want that, right? So that's sort of some of the possibilities. Some of the challenges we face are, protection of kind of our information, as, for example, architects are licensed to do what they do because it revolves around health and safety. When we iterate, we are concerned about not only the health and safety, like if someone were to take that information or that documentation and use it in a different way than what's intended, it could be dangerous for other people because, they're not meeting certain codes or they're not following certain aspects of what's required as a baseline to be a designer. Some of the other challenges are just adoption in general. Having the right tools to plug in with existing frameworks would be amazing, and having that be accessible and easy to use for people of all different levels would also be amazing. When you work with folks and they learn a certain amount of skill set, but they're unable to progress to the next level because the tool becomes too complicated for use. I think that's also a detriment because people have gained so much knowledge over time that you don't want to lose that just because they can't use a tool. So, yeah.
Thank you. Now let's move to Kat. And Kat, so you heard David describe his process, right? And his relationship with these AI tools. And what was surprising to me is that actually he discovered new ways of expression through these kind of unforeseen discoveries, such as non-existence of gravity, right? So from your perspective, now we move to the, let's say we can think about specific case of Davey. So what are the potential legal issues? Like how can we help Davey to benefit from his art? And what are the unclear questions that come to your mind?
Yeah, so the main challenge that I see is that it seems like creators are looking at AI very differently than the legal framework is looking at AI. So, the Copyright Office has issued guidance for how to copyright a work of art that was where AI was used to assist in its creation. And their idea is, okay, just list out the things that you as the human did. To get a copyright, you have to have a human author. There's a human authorship requirement. So list out the things that you did and then just disclaim the things that the AI did. And that'll be our way of figuring out, oh, okay, here are the elements that are copyrightable because there's a human author, and here are the things that aren't copyrightable because it was just this magical tool that gave you this. Now, that's very different than the creator's perspective. And, if you think about tools on a spectrum, you've got your artist's paintbrush. Nobody's ever attributed the paintbrush with any, disclaimed any part of what was happening because of the paintbrush. You've got a camera, which is doing a lot more than a paintbrush, but still nobody's ever been disclaiming, the elements of a photograph that were actually just the light hitting the film. And you've got like, I don't know, I went on an acid trip. Like, should I be disclaiming the impact that the LSD had on this particular creative process? So there's a lot of There are a lot of tools that you might use to create art. Wow, people really like that one. And it's going to be really difficult, I think, to actually try to secure legal protection for art when the Copyright Office is looking at the tool in such a different way than the creators are. And, I don't have any magical solution to that problem yet, unfortunately. But I think that that's our main challenge.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Jacques, you come from Switzerland, from probably a very deeply historically influential tradition, how people understand creativity. We have lots of historical lessons, especially about this romantic notion of authorship, right? Where we romanticize authors who express their inner feelings and they should reward to be protected. What are your perspectives to this?
Thank you very much, Paul. So it's great to be here, just reacting on this question. On acid, I think one aspect too is before going to perhaps more serious issue is about, and perhaps a question to you, to what extent artists are willing to disclose the creation process? Because I was reading the other day an interesting approach, which is to say we don't really somehow about trade secrets. So no one should know exactly how it came to that outcome. And I was very interested to hear you explain a bit the process. So that's one thing which is important. And coming to perhaps more legal discussion, Switzerland is not necessarily that important in that respect specifically, but perhaps for the reason that, as some of you may know, we have the privilege in Geneva to host the World IP Organization, and also for those who are really into IP, the Berne Convention, which is the International Convention on Copyrights, is somehow anchored in Switzerland for a certain reason. But I think what is fascinating in this respect is, as you were saying earlier, is to see how you can distinguish and how you should distinguish what is of human origin and what is not, because as we know or may know, if it is not of human origin, there shall be no protection at all. So it's really a black or white approach so far. Either you qualify as a human author creation, then you deserve protection, or not, and then there is you have nothing. To me, the question is, at some point, shall we move somehow or in a system by which you would have some kind of a lighter protection, which could combine somehow what you describe very adequately, like this interaction between technology and human, to see how that may potentially force the legal system to evolve, which is, as of today, extremely human-centered, as you were saying. It's anthropocentric by essence. I'm not too sure to what extent this can survive the test of AI and the test of time, even in the short term. So I think we will have to see. And just one final comment also about what you said with respect to US law, of course, in many respects. The entire world, I can certainly speak for myself, is observing what's happening at the US Copyright Office. But one important point is to realize that in many legal systems, if not all legal systems, except in the US, there is no formality to obtain copyright protection. So here, if you want to have full protection, you have to do so on a control. But what will happen in other systems where you're not supposed to do anything? So that means you will have to create a new kind of obligation of transparency, or which author may have to disclose how they came up with certain creation, which will be kind of intriguing to implement, because it's, as of today, nowhere to be found. So as of today, you can deserve the protection without doing anything, needing any formal steps to be taken. So that's going to be interesting how in other parts of the world, in system where there is no obligation to register, how that duty of transparency may apply. Interesting time.
If I may ask Davey again, could you respond to Jacques' question? And actually, I also have another twist to this comment. In addition to disclosing which part of your creativity has been, let's say, ignited by AI tools, also, can you tell us a little bit more? How do you understand what is original?
Yeah, sure. So, as he was talking, it brings back these experiences that I've been having when I welcome people into my studio, that the main questions that I get over and over is, how did you do this? And it's for me, the least interesting question that can possibly be asked to me. It's not that I have trade secrets. I'm just not very interested in describing the technical process. I thought today it's appropriate because of the nature of this panel, but in general, the technical production, the process of technical production is literally the least interesting thing that I do as an artist. The most interesting thing that I do is the conception, living and finding ideas. So I've become, I wouldn't say that, but I've challenged myself to field those questions about how did I do this and convert them into why did I do this, or what does it mean, or what could it mean, rather than the technical stuff. And then just I don't know if this is exactly an answer to your question, but when you were talking about the ownership, actually everyone was talking about ownership in terms of the human. Legally, it strikes me that it's not that actually I think you nailed it there. It's an anthropocentric issue. The problem from my perspective is that we need to figure out ways of recognizing. We start by recognizing that there are other intelligences, not even just synthetic intelligence. I mean, AI we could consider a synthetic intelligence. Just a small aside, I think the term AI will be out of fashion at some point because it's a bit derogatory for intelligences. And so like synthetic intelligence would be more of a term that would make more sense to me. But there's also, mineral intelligences, other types, like, I don't know if anyone's read this book about trees, but there's an incredible, The Secret Life of Trees, I think. That's a highly intelligent creature. I don't know. But to me, it's more like, it almost just shines a light on how we can only see ourselves at the center of everything, and how, from a law perspective, from a science perspective, you look across all the different fields, and you just see all these years of development of us not recognizing that we're not the center of the universe, or that we are. So I would be more interested in seeing a legal protection for other types of intelligences. But of course, that would require a kind of revamping of science and social science. I don't know, it's kind of a big idea.
Would anyone like to comment on this? How about the audience? I know that there are so many people in the audience who are working in these domains. So I saw you were the first to raise the hand, but.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for calling on me. My name is Celium. I'm tech and art adjacent, I guess. I have a question for Katrina. I thought we would start off with kind of a fun question. In the Twitterverse, AI has often been compared to as being a synthetic intelligence worthy of rights. Can you see yourself in the future representing an AI artist?
That is very interesting. I do want to defer back to you if you were asking a specific question, and then we can address that toward the end, or do we want to? Great. Okay. It is hard to imagine myself representing synthetic intelligence. It's very easy to imagine myself representing a corporation, right? Which is a total fiction. But to actually represent an entity that is neither a person or a corporation is really challenging. I mean, I do think it will happen. Maybe I'm just not ready. I don't know. Yes, there are quite a few things where I think, the world is heading in that direction. I do think we're probably moving in a direction of more acknowledgement rather than less. But it's scary to me, to be honest.
So how about John? I just remember the sequence more or less.
Oh, should I pass this on? I do have an immediate follow-up question to this exchange. If a synthetic intelligence is so developed that they would need a lawyer, would they need a lawyer, or would they just be their own? lawyer.
I mean, that's, that's the thing about the singularity, right? Where we're all sort of imagining that somehow we're going to get to this point where then all of a sudden it's just every answer will be answered and all knowledge will be there. So it is possible that then, sort of a general AI will just know and will be able to write all the legal briefs. I do wonder if at that point the legal system will exist in the same way that it does now, because it strikes me as it would be an odd world to live in where we've reached the singularity, but also somehow we have this system of courts and judges that we need to be reliant on. Or will there just be some kind of system where everything is somehow everything is automatically decided, and then whatever, sort of IRL punishments need to happen are meted out. We easily get to the world of, oh God, where are we going and what's going to happen? So yes, I agree. It is quite possible that once AI gets to that level of intelligence, my services will no longer be necessary.
So I have a question for Jacques and Katrina. But first, just say thank you to Katrina for revealing that Reed Smith is both a fiction and a purveyor of LSD as part of his training. So the question is really, do you as lawyers think that the correct way for the AI and creativity copyright issue to be resolved is by better legislation, evolution of the Berne Convention or national legislation, or better contracts? Because right now it appears that there's an enormous amount of creativity that's kind of crashing into ignorance. People don't know what's going on. But I think underlying it, what you're describing, which is the way that the regulators differentiate automated, artificial and human creativity is not quite correct on its face. Because in architecture, which is the field of creativity that I know well, a lot of architecture is semi-automated, right? So if you parameterize the creation of these windows, you didn't draw them, a machine did. So we're already in a situation where there's a gray area in terms of authorship. So the question is, should we be looking for better regulation or better contracts or something else?
Sure. So I would say I have a great deal of faith in the sort of iterative process of the court system. So, and that's definitely a symptom of sort of where I am sitting within the system. So take that with a grain of salt. But, in looking at a lot of the litigation and the results of, especially cases that have come out that are not necessarily about AI, but are, touching upon subjects that will probably impact how we deal with AI in the future. I have a lot of faith that actually we're going to triangulate on the right solutions. I have a harder time believing that about legislation, mostly just because we know so little and there's so many sort of edge cases. And so my general sort of feeling is I'm a little, scared of where legislation comes out. I think a lot of, for example, privacy legislation, is sort of developed in a vacuum where, there are experts in the room, but you still end up with ignorance impacting what ends up happening. And then the people on the ground who have to implement it have a lot of trouble. So I want to put my chips in with the courts.
Perhaps this is a difference between a common law system and a civil law system. I'm not too sure. The courts, of course, obviously have to do their job. But I think more generally looking at what's happening perhaps at the international level, if you look at hard law instrument like international treaties, say Berne Convention, there is little hope that something will happen in the short term because it's difficult to find consensus for many reasons. But that doesn't mean that the battle is lost. I think one promising approach is soft law instruments, like perhaps that connects somehow with what you're saying in the sense that I think what is important in many of these technological challenges is to try to find ways how you bring people together, have the input of the industry, they know what they're doing, and react on that. But have some kind of soft guidelines which have the ability to be adapted. Because of course the risk with hard regulation is that you're stuck with the system and you risk to be what we would say not technology neutral. You have a new rule and then you stuck with it and actually it doesn't reflect what's happening in reality. And as we know and as we experience on a daily basis, it's moving so fast Well, even if I were to think about a hardware solution, I'm not sure how it should look like. So I think it's very important to make sure that we do have some guidelines. I think what US Copyright is doing is great. Also, but subject to your comments and correction, I don't see it as a kind of hardware instrument. We look at guidelines. And I think this is exactly the way that we should go, perhaps also the international level, but with the input of the companies which create this instrument. And just one quick word on contract. Contract might help, but the risk is, I mean, if you want to basically impose the solution to everyone, that's not the right approach from a legal perspective, because contract will only be binding on those contracting parties, not against the rest of the world. So you have, might be one of the tool in a toolbox, but contract, from my perspective, cannot really solve by itself.
I'd like to add one thing to that is, you know, the idea of kind of these architectural tools are just that, they're tools, and they have to be used by humans. And so I believe that we still are the creators using the tools. That's still just a paintbrush. It's like asking a calculator to do math for you, very complicated math. But to make that, it has to have human input and human guidance. And so in that sense, it has to come from your vision and your design idea, right? It doesn't just make itself. And so I think that's an important distinction is our tools right now aren't smart enough to do it on their own without human assistance.
I think as to whether there needs to be more legislation, I think people deeply misunderstand our current system of intellectual property, even in the United States. It was supposed to incentivize creativity. That's why we kind of keep chipping away at what otherwise would be a public commons that we can just share with each other. And I went to Disney World last week, and I felt really offended. I was like, these are the mythologies and dreams of people, they're being commoditized back to us. But when you think about whether there needs to be, so go back to that. At least in the history of US copyright law, we don't reward sweat of the brow. We don't reward that you worked really hard on something. Working really hard is not an independent legal basis to carve out that public commons and prevent other people from enjoying and sharing and remixing. You have to have creative expression that is original. And neither is style, because if style was cut out of the public commons and people couldn't build on each other. So I think either as a society, we need to come to peace with and understand like why our intellectual property regime is the way it is, or there needs to be a fundamental public reckoning with basically the past several hundred years about our intellectual property system. But I think that understanding probably and that discussion needs to happen before it be more regular.
I want to make a comment about the style. I'm also teaching a class and talk to many kids about the style. We talked about David Guetta creating the, let's say, mix in the style of Eminem. He used ChatGPT to create the lyrics. He used another tool to create the music, and then he compiled it together. And then there were many discussions, is style protected? And we need to remember that style has never been protected. And then if you think in practice, like how do you implement this kind of rule when somebody says that, hey, this is my style and I don't want that people copying my style. So the first question is like, at what point my drawings become a style? Like who decides? Is it me? Is it a court? Like who decides? And then once it becomes a style, we recognize as a style, then how do you implement it? Do you give it like as opt-out right, as opt-in right? One tool for these emerging generative AI platforms is that, well, we can create a system where artists who think that they have their own style, they can suggest AI platforms that they add a watermark that it's created in the style of Davey, right? But then do we actually want to do that? Let's move on to the next question. I think someone has the microphone.
Hi, my name is Mark Hafton. Thank you very much for the perspectives and great panel, and thanks for the host. I'm going to make an assertion and then ask a question. I'd like to assert that our goal in creating these tools is to increase the level of human creativity and enable people who are otherwise less creative to be more creative. If this assertion holds, then the question is for the artists in the room, does it matter if those tools are creatively owned by the community via some sort of an open source technology, or they're owned by a corporation in a sort of proprietary way? And perhaps on the legal side, it's a similar question whether it could make a difference in the greater scheme of things, whether the models are open source or proprietary. Thank you.
Kat.
Well, he addressed it to the artist
Well,
first, so I was going to defer.
That's a really complicated, I feel like that's a bit above my head, the question, because the assertion is hard to just kind of blanketly agree with. Like, you have to ask the people that are making these tools what their goal is, honestly, because my job is to break them and use them wrong. And then the second part of the question, which was what? Was
whether it would matter to you if they're proprietary or open source.
Absolutely. It would matter to me personally in a very big way, because I've already run into that problem as a potential early beta tester on a piece of software that I couldn't agree with the terms that the company was giving to the artists. I couldn't agree to it. Actually, I should have told this story during this panel, but it had a lot to do with who owns the images and what you can do with what you're able to produce with the tool. So I absolutely would love it if it really should be an open source tool, but I just don't see it going there. That's a bit of a dream. Maybe not. I mean, there are a lot of the just a quick thing. A lot of those platforms are built on open source code, so it is an interesting. There is something interesting there that I'm sure that you guys can have it. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, it's, if it's an open source tool, then I'm so much less likely to be called in, right? I'm so much less likely to be involved. And so when it's an open source tool, you've got, the sort of individual feeding the inputs, generally speaking, and then, the tool is sort of created by the community, and then the, whatever the outputs are. But generally speaking, the output, brand and copyright IP holders want to hold the entity creating the tool responsible, right? So from the perspective of how much of this is going to be sort of controlled, if the tools are open source, then that'll be much less likely, because it'll just be much less likely that the enforcement is actually going to take place. That said, it's like, who do we represent, right? We're generally representing corporate entities that have the tools, or, corporate entities that have the IP that are then interested in what's coming out of the tools. So I think the difference between those two things is going to make a big difference in terms of which cases move forward, which cases are actually sort of setting the precedents on these issues.
Great. I have a question for Max. Yeah, thanks for hosting this, and thanks everyone for participating in the panel. Max, so you're involved, I imagine, right now pretty heavily in some what will be precedent-defining cases, right? And to me, it seems like there's two really different outcomes. I can, I know where you probably stand on it, but I'm curious how you look at the different outcomes and the implications that will have for how this develops. In other words, so just to provide some context, so is the art that's used to train the models copyrightable, or like is there any credit to artists? And when we talk about creators, to me it seems like there's two very different types of creators in this world. The ones that are kind of starting fresh, that have a very small body of work pre-AI, who are using AI to create new work, versus artists who have maybe a large body of work, like well-defined body of work, or a stock photography house who has a whole collection and, you know, piecing together bits of that. And obviously like some of the watermarks have shown up and things like that. So I'm curious how you see the potential, like the outcomes from this and like what kind of impact it could have for how this develops.
Yeah, so I think there's broadly two big copyright. There's many more than just two, but the two ones that you're bringing up are, to what extent can a company or group or a single person scrape the internet, reuse, learn from, and train on data? Then the other question is, what happens when, and kind of to the liability question, what happens when the image is output from one of these systems that is like the Getty case, which thankfully I'm not involved in Getty. Would want to be involved in that one. But so I think this is maybe kind of a lame answer, but I think the law is mostly right. These people are just as it is now, and people will figure that out. Why is the law right? Well, because on training is almost certainly fair use. And I don't think anyone really wants to live in a world where it's not fair use anymore. Because then Europe doesn't want to live in that world. We talked about sweat of the brow. Yeah. Just so much, like, I think we shoot ourselves in the foot sometimes with how we, so to give you a little more background, we're in heavy contact with the EFF. We're in heavy contact with a lot of industry participants because we're a money-making organization, but we actually care not to destroy society if we can help it. We want to make sure the outcomes of these cases are broadly in line with the people that want as big of a public commons and as much consumer and user freedom as possible. On the other end, I think it's like, I also think existing copyright law is probably right. System outputs an image that is substantially similar, not just style, but substantially similar to the input. What is like that? I think that we probably already have protections in place. So the gap, I think, is that people feel ownership over their styles. And that doesn't really mesh with current copyright law. And I also think that people feel an ickiness or kind of an invasion about having their data scraped. It doesn't really fit in well with any current legal regime. So I think there are lots of other important societal and legal questions that are kind of like the boils coming to the surface on the AI issue, but these are really reflective of deeper societal questions that we got to figure out how we feel about. No.
I would disagree with that as well.
Yeah, so you heard both lawyers over here say that's not true, so I'm not going to repeat that. You know, I'm going to tell you after why it's not true. It's totally not true. But let's pretend it was true. Probably market forces. So let's say there's no fair use, we can't do anything. Then the data holders and the people that want to train are going to be forced to engage in heavy licensing discussions, and there'll be good things and bad things about that. The good things are, I want artists to get credit for their work. And I know that some feel displaced by the advance of technology, and that's definitely, we don't want to stop art. We want to increase creativity. I think a bad outcome is like, you're going to have a million new ASCAPs in that situation, a million new royalty collection agencies who are going to serve as middlemen. I think that's upsetting to me is like, I can't see a world in which the artist doesn't get hurt because it's just a history of exploitation. I would prefer not to hurt artists further if that was possible. But anyway, the short answer is probably bilateral licensing agreements between the creators and the trainers if their use wasn't.
Hi, yeah, so I kind of want to go a step further on this whole discussion of copyright and fair use, right? To me, this is coming from a place both obviously of emotion, but also of monetizability. How do you sort of think of, and there's two layers here, One is, say you're someone that's training on crawl data of any sort. That's not just Midjourney, that every single big foundational model is doing the same thing. How do you think about monetizability? So if you're making money off models trained off that data, and also actually as a second layer to you, say, for example, you were using an open source model, but the data that it's trained on is not been gotten through licensing or anything of that sort, and you're still saving money by sort of using that tooling. How do you guys sort of think about this, both ideologically and also legally? Do you see a future where there's a huge lawsuit settlement that forces people to pay back these artists, or do you see something going forward, or just neither of those ways?
Let's take away the legal stuff for a second. Just talk about the monetizability. I was a big open source guy. I did that for like a decade before I joined Midjourney. So I'm dyed in the wool. I want people to use free stuff, build on it. So why, if there's open source models, do people still use Midjourney or still use like other platforms? And that, to me, that must be because there is some kind of service or some kind of added benefit or value that is different from the other tools that, I mean, those are just raw market forces because they don't have to. There's so many, it's actually a very crowded field. And so for Midjourney, for example, I think it's like, what is our ad? We have a very particular aesthetic. Images look a certain way. We also have a particular community that they get together and they have certain types of ideas and they have certain types of ways that they like to collaborate with each other. So I think on monetizability, it matters less if it's open source or not. And really everyone in the value chain just has to figure out what is that unique thing that they're bringing to it. Both will work, both will make money. I don't know if sorry, I didn't.
I think that's an interesting question. So, we originally kind of started using more open source tools when 3D development came on board, for example. Back in 2000 when Revit came online, or SketchUp that happened before that. SketchUp was more of that open source. People started to use that. And then Revit came along and it was proprietary, it was licensed, and the quality was significantly better. And so I think that's what we run into, like from the perspective of trying to accomplish our work faster, better, is quality sometimes you just need to pay for in order to get it done on time and the right way. So, we find like some amount of digital assets that we're able to import into the work and modify and use that started as open source that we can bring in and manage on our own. Oftentimes they're messy, they're crude, and you end up just remaking it anyway. So I think that's something that we find often is, you can't, like, for example, you'll bring in furniture assets and the chairs will be really low quality. You can't change the materials. It's got too many meshes. Like, it's just difficult to use. And but for quick creation, like when we're just starting the concept of a project, we'll be in SketchUp. We'll use that a lot because it's a more fluid and more dynamic workflow, and you're able to get things done a lot faster. So it's sort of, we've got a little bit of one, a little bit of the other. They're both used for very different things. Open source we find easier to work with from kind of that upfront creative aspect of concept. But when it comes down to like producing high quality work, then we really need the licensed tools. Or at least that's how it is now.
Perhaps quickly react to the discussion. Of course, I will not express any opinion as to whether it's fair use or not in terms of data mining for obvious reason, but I think it's important because I'm not a US lawyer. That's the reason. What I wanted to say first is that you may have regulatory competition. For instance, Japan, they are very much AI friendly. So they have adopted a regulatory framework which makes it possible and legal to scrape data. So that you may have, like to your points earlier, you may have regulatory approach. But my second point, which is more important, is try to think also creatively about the system that you may want to apply in order to try to balance the competing interests. Because to me, one concern, I mentioned that earlier in another context, the risk is this black or white approach, and the risk is also the uncertainty of litigation, which is damaging to everyone and to society as a whole. Now, one way to potentially, we recognize I'm Swiss in trying to balancing the competing interests and find some kind of compromise solution. But one way to do that from a legal perspective is to go via compulsory licensing. So, I mean, you have the right to do whatever you want, basically, but you pay. So that means you're not blocking your activities. And there is, and also to your very important point, it's saying you don't want to spend a lot of time and energy in trying to negotiate licensing deal because it's too costly, it's going to be burdensome, it's not going to work. May work, but it's going to be too costly. But you have a system, and of course, we have no solution at this stage, but how becomes a system by which you would have a way by which you would get some remuneration for the owners, but at the same time, you would make it possible. Examples. And I point to say that even, of course, creators are creative, and that's great. But hopefully, regulators should also be, and policymakers should also be creative and innovative in trying to find the balance which should be ultimately beneficial for society.
Thank you. Hey, I have a quick question for you. First of all, fascinating discussion on style. My name's John. I'm a founder of Style Love. Styleof.com. We somehow got that. I don't know how. But we started it because in December, we were all nerding out on Midjourney results, on the different versions, on Stable Diffusion, on Dream Booth. And particularly, we want to allow anyone to see themselves in the style of anything. And particularly want to support artists' rights while doing that. And the reason we wanted to do that was we saw this digital illustrator who has millions of followers have his artwork used to create a specific model of his work and then release as open source. And a lot of his fans were like, we feel rightly like, what is this? Like, is this okay? This seems weird. And when we looked into it, we're not legal experts at all. And this is why this has been so educational and fascinating. But it felt like there wasn't a protection on the style, but at the same time, it felt wrong to take use of their style without giving them some sort of compensation. So we've been trying to build a platform that cuts them in from the beginning. So if their name is referenced in the prompt, because a lot of the prompts, right? Like they have 1, 2, 4 artist names. We want to cut them in from the beginning, even when they're not on the platform. And then when they come on the platform, give them the majority of revenue, just like you would to a YouTube creator. So I just wanted to ask you 2 questions. One, what do you think of that approach? And then second, Max, can we get access to the Midjourney API? Something because we're model agnostic. Thank you.
Probably not. And it's not because we don't want to. It's just we want to. It's just we're a very small company. We have everyone focused on the consumer product. Basically, once a month, go, hey, let's do some API terms. Let's maybe realistically like 6 months. Yes. As to the artists, I get what you're saying. It does feel. I know what you mean. There's the law, and then there's like the feeling of like, well, but they did this work. They should be compensated. We're still open to it. We're looking into it. What we don't want to do is injure artists. We don't want to be a substitute for creating productions of artists. And at the same time, if you look at what people are so yeah, there was like lots of generations of images in the style of. But just if you look at the aesthetic, the thing that users do, that's typically early on in their use. Like eventually people burn out. Your brain just burns out on trying to make everything look like everything. And after that hurdle, you really stop trying to make things that you've seen before. So we both want to, I think it makes sense to, and we're still looking into, find a way to compensate artists fairly. But I think we also need to be hip to like, this is something else. And the style question might resolve itself naturally because people, in the history of visual art, people don't want to just make the same reproductions over and over again. Things have to evolve.
Just very quickly, so why I'm asking all these questions. I started a company called Treasury. My name is John Manicherry, and it's basically a licensing system for very high quality and very high value 3D building models. And we have some of the very, very top architecture companies in the world as co-founders. Google's AI fund is one of our venture investors, and we just got some large film studios involved. And so I'm right under the thumb of large creators screaming at me saying, you mustn't allow my shit to be stolen by the AI guys. and so they don't really know what's going on. And we're trying to navigate all these questions technically, legally, commercially. And so I guess my final question before I stop talking and annoying you guys is, what would you say to creators from your various perspectives to encourage them to engage and to bring forward their work to generative systems and digital deployment in general? And what would you say to people who are using content, not consumers using Midjourney, but more like commercial users, about how they should address the licensing issue? What would you say to creators, and what would you say to people that probably should be paying for licenses now?
One of the things that I would say to creators, I recognize that probably the legal argument is less convincing. I am pretty convinced that the scraping is going to be considered fair use. But I think what you can ask people to focus on is, what does the end result actually end up looking like? And is that end result actually replacing the market for your work? Because at the very end of the day, when, whatever user comes up with something and they post it on social media, if that is, very, very close to your client's end product, and it replaces your client's end product, that's almost certainly not fair use, and that will be actionable. And if it is referential in some way, or is, is not actually going to replace the use of your client's work, but does somehow trigger people to think of your client's work, then I actually think it's a great publicity opportunity. And it's sort of more about, look, give people access to what you've produced so that they can produce more and promote you. And I think a lot of the time, whatever the inputs are, the outputs are going to be almost unrecognizable. And your initial input is just going to be, it's going to be impossible to tell whether your initial input actually ended up in the output, at which point I don't think as a creator, you need to be worried.
I think there are 3 questions from the audience, and then probably we should wrap up.
I'm curious, mainly pointed towards the artists at the table, or the creators. So as creators in the age of AI, what do you view as the role of the legal system right now? Like, we're talking to these attorneys about what we think is going to happen with policy, but like, does that even matter to you that much in the day-to-day? What do you hope the legal system might do right now? Is there anything you're worried the legal system might decide right now, or is it something that just doesn't really come up for you at all?
I think sort of like John mentioned, is this concern about, I don't know, I could distill it down to basically ego, right? We're afraid that our content will go out there and someone's going to make exactly that same thing. And wait, what was your question?
Do you think that much about what the legal system's doing right now? And then is there anything you're hoping they'll do and anything you're worried they might?
Not worried. I don't think AI is going to advance fast enough in my lifetime to make me nervous. Maybe it will, but I don't think so. We'll see. But I think creators are just nervous because we want to protect, kind of authenticity and how, like, being able to say that I was clever enough to come up with that on my own. I didn't need something to assist me to do that, like to come up with that idea. Like, yes, maybe it's a tool that I use that helps, but doesn't create it for me. And I think that's sort of where we're just worried about. I think the ego fear of many creators is like, is it actually mine?
So yeah, I'm not particularly worried about like my practice in regards to what you're asking about. I am like ideologically worried about the conversation in general, and I do think that the questions and the conversation tonight is exactly the right questions and the right things to be talking about. I do wish that that I could find more examples of the people who are making the tools asking artists opinion about how to, or even lawyers asking the artist's opinion, not just assuming that they think they're doing the right thing for the artist's mind. I did a little research when I was actually a lot of research when I was finding different tools to use, and I researched the companies and researched who was involved in the teams and everything. I had a lot of trouble finding artists on the teams. I found a lot of people who had computer science degrees who were making art. I couldn't find people, not to gatekeep, but I couldn't find people with like fine art careers, galleries. I couldn't find people with MFAs or BFAs with a normal art. I just had a lot of trouble finding like non-computer science people who are the in residence artists. That's kind of what I hope is that we get brought into the conversation in a larger way than just being given something and say, hey, you like it? It's what you wanted? No, it's not actually. I'm kind of an outlier, as you maybe have gathered, in terms of like an AI artist in a way, but I was invited. But yeah, so I don't know if that was an answer. Good question.
I just had a question about like the way, say, an AI system that trains on these models. Now, I don't know if this has kind of already been covered or not, but effectively, it's kind of creating a copy in the weights. And is that kind of like, how does that sort of affect the fair use argument where it's almost pretty much absorbing, like if you wanted it to reproduce like your art exactly, it could do that. But it doesn't actually need to do it. It's kind of like absorb the knowledge in a way without like copying it, but somehow in the weights. No.
Yeah, I can address that. Sorry, I can't see your face. I think one of the things that we've been sort of dancing around that maybe I'll just address is there's a case that I'm pretty confident means that all the scraping and the inputting is actually fair use. It's the Google Books case. It's from about 8 years ago. And basically what happened is, Google was digitizing all these books, scraping all these books, and then they were spitting out, tiny little snippets of the results to the people who were searching for the books. And so you'd enter your search query, you'd end up with exactly the right passage of a book. I don't know how many of you actually had this experience, but it was magical. I mean, you would end up with like one page of a book and you were like, that's exactly what I needed. And in that case, the Second Circuit found that it was fair use because, was it the Second Circuit or the Ninth Circuit? Okay, found that thank you, found that it was fair use because even though they were taking the books wholesale and copying the books on the back end wholesale, what they were actually then outputting at the end were just little snippets. And those snippets weren't replacing the market for the whole book. Actually, what was happening was that people were identifying the correct books that they wanted, and then they were buying the books, citing the books, using, quotes. I mean, I'm sure there were use cases where people were using quotes where they might have otherwise bought the book because they only needed that tiny snippet. But so the back end wholesale copying has already been determined to be fair use. Now that wasn't in the context of AI. That was just in the context of copying something in order to then produce a different output. But my belief is that that case is going to sort of determine the outcome on the scraping question. And so it's really the output that we're going to be focused on. So if the output is dissimilar enough from the input and is not replacing the market for that input, I think that is the question we're going to be looking at. So if you're producing something almost exactly because you've just decided to query it to, produce Andy Warhol's Campbell's soup cans or whatever, and it just does, that will be an infringing use because you're only asking for one, source material and you're recreating something exactly. But the vast majority of the time, what's coming out the other end is going to be more like a snippet because it's just going to be ever so slightly influenced by millions of things. And I think that is much more likely to be considered a fair use.
I have a question about if the lawsuit kind of swing to the creator side from the Getty and the class actions were currently going on. What does that mean for the startups who are building on top of those foundational models? Obviously, they're suing the foundational model companies, but how about like the startups who are building on top of the foundation models? What does that mean for them?
So it's tough to say in the abstract because depending upon what you're doing with the building on top of, you might be doing something that's actionable or not actionable. If you haven't been sued, you're probably okay though so far. It's worth paying attention to what is going forward. I would say it's worth monitoring what you are doing when you're building on top of these other models to look at your outputs and decide whether those outputs, hire somebody to help you figure out what your outputs are, what's going on with those. Definitely be aware of your use, but I would say, it's going to be mostly the kind of main builders who, at least in this first wave, we're going to be paying a lot of attention to. I don't know if you agree with that.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I mean, just one comment on the class action. It's not just fair use, it's also injury. You've brought up multiple times, like, is this hurting the market for the original? And this kind of goes back to the royalty paying question as well. No, people get really popular on one platform. Consumers don't typically go to an AI platform, so they don't buy original. There's still value. There's still a market just to buy someone's thing, even just because their name. And what we found, this is just anecdotal, but it drives search traffic. So the best attribution we think is just like, we see someone being used a lot, if we can go to shift off to their gallery or link or spotlight them. We've seen no evidence of anyone. There's a lot of hurt feelings and a lot of fear, and that's understandable. What we haven't really seen is commercial injury.
Well, the monetization is something that is that's in the ether of the legality of it, because if you're not monetizing it, a court is much more likely to say that's fair use.
So I have a quick story I'd like to share to respond to some of the audience concerns about creator concerns. So I competed in the Olympics in 2018, and I had a ski run that was replicated maybe 1,000,000 different times in different memes and articles. And I was really resistant to that. And I just kind of hid away from that. But what got me out of that was really kind of owning my own story and then incorporating that feedback and creative uses of my ski run into like stand-up comedy a few years later. So I would encourage creators that are concerned about AI using their work or being inspired by their work or using their trained models of their work in creative ways to think about maybe accepting part or all of what's going on, but also making their voice heard, because I think the more that these creators or artists or athletes' work is out there, the more people are going to notice it, but the more they're going to pay attention to the original creator of that works. And my question that I have is, what do you all, or what do some of you, the panelists, anticipate the future of stand-up comedy being in relation to creativity and AI? You didn't expect that question.
All right, there's a short story. You should read it. It's by Borges, called Pierre Menard's Don Quixote. Just go read that story and then think about it. That's the best answer.
I feel like we should end on that cryptic note. Nobody has any idea what that means.
Go read it. What's interesting about the story is it's a contemplation of if someone else had rewritten word for word Don Quixote. It was the same exact product, and it kind of it goes into. I've seen jokes written by AI. They're not funny to me. Something in your brain. Part of humor is that there's a person there. You're relating to them on a person-to-person level. I mean, maybe it's the case that because of AI, you're not going to be able to know anymore. And but I don't think AI is going to tear away our desire to connect authentically with people. So I don't think it's going to affect stand-up comedy.
I think it'll just help stand-up comedy. So yeah.
I'm just going to add one little thing is that I saw an amazing tweet recently that said, I'm over here digging ditches and they've got AI writing poetry and painting paintings.
Okay, guys, so without me asking all of the panelists, give some predictions about the future. How about we end up here? All of us got lots of inspiration and ideas from this panel. I think the most important takeaway thing is that we need to have more interdisciplinary conversations, more friendly conversations that are not black and white, good and evil, but really think about the opportunities and how can we work together to, come up with a better future. Before we wrap up, I would like to once again thank Kat and the entire team who hosted us here. And then thank you so much.